I'm Aisha Roscoe, and this is the Sunday Story. If you drive a couple hours north of Seattle, you'll find a lush valley, miles of farmland, gray mountains in the distance, and the ruins of an old psychiatric hospital. This hospital, Northern State, opened more than 100 years ago. It once had a working farm and its own power plant. Here's Sydney Brownstone, an investigative reporter with the Seattle Times, describing it.
Northern State was founded on this idea of occupational therapy, this notion that if you are given work to do, like on the farm or in the dairy, in the laundry, you will develop better mental hygiene and then be able to return to society. It was a very hopeful time.
Northern State is how psychiatric care used to look in the U.S., sprawling campuses with armies of doctors and nurses employed by state governments.
The buildings themselves look like they could be Tuscan villas or something. So they have these beautiful terracotta tiles, these neatly manicured lawns. This was done very intentionally for the purpose of healing. But, some historians and experts say that it had a double purpose. It also served to make people outside the institution feel better about what was going on inside of it.
States confine patients for years or even decades in hospitals like these. And doctors sometimes use brutal methods to try to control their behavior, induce comas, lobotomies. Then, in the middle of the last century, antipsychotic drugs arrived, and doctors adopted new progressive views about psychiatric care. As a result, states started to shut down the old-style hospitals. Over the past half-century, 84% of state psychiatric hospital beds in the U.S. have disappeared. Most of those vanished in a single decade, from 1970 to 1980. This movement was called deinstitutionalization. The idea was to transfer patients to smaller treatment centers in their communities, but it didn't go as planned. And today, it's widely viewed as one of the most disastrous U.S. policies of the past century. In the new podcast, Lost Patients, reporters from Seattle public radio station KUOW and the Seattle Times delve into this history. They try to understand how we've ended up where we are today, with seriously mentally ill people cycling between emergency rooms, jails, and homelessness. What went wrong? After a break, Lost Patients host Will James
Back to mental illness. Our chief aim is to get people out of state custodial institutions and back into their communities and homes without hardship or danger.
In the 1960s, two ideas of mental health care were colliding. For decades, society had leaned on psychiatric hospitals to hold patients it saw as having little hope of getting better, to separate them from everyone else, sometimes hide them for the rest of their lives. This is called custodial care. But President John F. Kennedy was pushing a new model, getting patients better and returning them to society as quickly as possible with the help of these new antipsychotic drugs. When Kennedy's sister Rosemary was 23, she underwent a lobotomy, leaving her mostly unable to walk or talk. She spent the rest of her life in institutions. Kennedy, informed by this family history, challenged states to get people out of custodial care and treat them closer to home. He envisioned a country where, quote, the cold mercy of custodial care would be replaced by the open warmth of community. Kennedy's 1963 Community Mental Health Act set aside $150 million to build and staff 1,500 community mental health centers around the country.
If we launch a broad new mental health program now, it will be possible within a decade or two to reduce the number of patients now under custodial care by 50% or more.
Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act into law on Halloween 1963. It was the last bill he signed.
Here's a piece of copy that was rushed to me and was torn off from the United Press in Dallas. President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas.
Kennedy was assassinated 3 weeks later.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m.
Northern State Hospital embraced Kennedy's vision. It wasn't just the open door policy. the hospital shifted its entire purpose to getting patients discharged and back into their hometowns as quickly as possible. A Seattle Times article from the 60s summed up this new way of operating. Quote, patients are admitted, given drugs, stabilized, allowed some freedom over their daily routines, some visits home, then as soon as they're ready, released. The rhythm of the hospital changed. In 1955, Northern State was at its peak with 2,200 patients at any one time. By 1970, that number was down by almost 2/3 to 700 patients at a time. There was almost one employee for each patient, and the numbers kept dropping. Washington had 3 state psychiatric hospitals in 3 corners of the state, northern, western, and eastern, and all 3 saw their daily populations shrinking. To psychiatrists, this was all part of the plan of deinstitutionalization. There were still thousands of people admitted to the state psychiatric hospitals every year. They were just cycling back out much more quickly, so there were fewer patients on the campuses at any one time. But their bosses in state government saw it differently.
The Northern State Hospital staff complement remains at 481, serving approximately 300 patients. The per diem costs at Northern have risen correspondingly from $22.45 last year to $35.78 now.
It's the classic tension between the people with the green eye shades, the bean counters, and the people providing the care.
Sydney Brownstone, an investigative reporter with the Seattle Times, has delved into Northern State's history, trying to understand how our modern psychiatric system took shape.
State officials were just looking at the declining numbers and the rising costs of care and going, we're not getting enough bang for our buck. And the people providing the care were going, no, you're getting bang for your buck, you're just not seeing it.
The person presiding over all this transformation in Washington state was Governor Dan Evans.
He is the kind of man who makes us proud to be Republicans.
Around this time, Evans was in his early 40s and having a moment. He gave the keynote speech in the 1968 Republican National Convention.
He is attractive. He is articulate. Oddly enough, his background by training and education is that of a civil engineer.
Let those who offer old promises step aside, and let those who promise new opportunities step forward.
But by the early 70s, Evans was just trying to hold Washington state together. Because of problems in the airline industry, Boeing laid off more than half its workforce. So many jobs disappeared that 2 real estate agents put up a billboard that said, will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights? Washington's unemployment rate hit 14%, the highest in the U.S. All this added to what the Seattle Times called the toughest budget crisis in state history, as tax revenue cratered. It wasn't long before Evans, trying to balance the budget, started eyeing Northern State, the smallest of the state's 3 psychiatric hospitals with a shrinking patient population and the highest per-patient costs.
So you have the governor, in particular, saying, it's time to wind this down. It's a massive cost, and it's time to transition to community health care, which is supposed to be better for the patients.
When Governor Evans argued for closing Northern State, he cited both the national movement away from psychiatric hospitals and toward community care and the potential cost savings. The issues of deinstitutionalization and money blended together.
I think a lot of politicians started calculating out what could be saved.
Chris Hudson is a social worker and academic who spent decades at Salem State University in Massachusetts studying our systems for caring for seriously mentally ill people. He says deinstitutionalization started with a civil rights agenda, freeing patients who were warehoused at psychiatric hospitals. But soon, a second motivation got mixed in, as leaders in state governments saw an opportunity to free themselves from a financial and political burden. Chris says these incentives acted like fuel, accelerating the push to close psychiatric hospitals.
Beginning in the early to mid-60s and 70s, those dramatic declines in the psychiatric beds, it was precipitous. There was a rush to get people out.
Governor Evans's plan was to transfer some of Northern State's patients to one of Washington's remaining psychiatric hospitals, Western State, and send the rest to community care. Washington had been building out a system of local treatment centers for a few years, and by 1973 had a program in every county of the state. But the system had never been tested in this way, and some lawmakers started to wonder whether it would hold up.
I just personally cannot buy the fact that the community mental health program is at this particular point in time ready and able to accept the caseloads, the mentally ill, the people that really need the care.
State Senator Lowell Peterson was a Democrat whose district covered Northern State.
And I, frankly, can't readily adapt myself or my thinking to the fact that we're going to displace some 400 or 500 people and automatically transpose them overnight from Northern to Western, and the community mental health centers are going to take care of all of our problems at a less expense.
People in Governor Evans's administration were adamant. Community care was ready to pick up where Northern State left off.
For the purposes of our budget discussion now, we again recommend the closure of Northern State Hospital as a state psychiatric hospital.
Governor Evans got his wish. Northern State Hospital would shut down by the end of 1973. According to newspaper stories from the time, Evans's administration thought closing the hospital would save something like $14 million over 2 years. And of those savings, some went back to Sedro-Woolley, the town where Northern State was, to ease the economic pain of the closure. And only a fraction was reinvested back into mental health.
Let's just be clear. $14 million would not have saved the mental health care system at all. But it does speak to our priorities. I mean, granted, the state was going through a period of austerity. It was slashing social service programs left and right. But you would think because such a fuss had been made about creating this new system of community healthcare that we would prioritize putting whatever money we had towards that promise.
A front-page story in Sedro-Woolley's local paper marks the hospital's closure. Most of the article is about employees scrambling to find new jobs. It says nothing about the fates of the patients.